The international peacekeepers' job in Lebanon became much harder this week when a bomb killed the Christian president-elect, and in response, Christian militias massacred several hundred, or several thousand, depending on sources, Palestinian refugees in a refugee camp. Israeli forces swept back into the city against the ceasefire terms and were at least aware of the massacre and probably actively complicit. The world community was shocked, and Israeli President Menachem Begin faced calls to resign over the matter. While all this was going on, a car crash claimed the life of Grace Kelly, Princess Grace of Monaco, at the age of 52. She'd suffered a stroke at the wheel of her car on the way down a mountain road, crashing 120 feet down the mountainside. Her daughter, 17-year-old Stephanie, was in the passenger seat and also suffered injuries but survived. On the 19th, Scott Fahlman, a computer scientist, suggested on a message board that certain markers should be used to distinguish jokey comments from serious ones, the first implementation of what would become known as emoticons. And the day after the Las Vegas race, the first episode of Knight Rider aired in the US, kickstarting a genre of vehicle-based action-adventure shows, including Blue Thunder, Airwolf, and Street Hawk, and paving the way for the competing NBC networks The A-Team. Meanwhile, more pieces of the 1983 Formula One jigsaw were starting to slot into place. Jacques Lafitte followed Eddie Cheever out of the door at Ligier and would partner Keke Rosberg at Williams next year, while the French team may also be looking for a new engine supplier, with Matra rumoured to be also on the brink of pulling out of F1. Other rumours suggested that Alfa Romeo, far from hiring a replacement for Bruno Giacomelli, were about to pull out of F1 too, after several disappointing years. Brabham technical director Gordon Murray wouldn't be at the race, as he stayed home to work on the new BT51 chassis for next year, not least because he was absolutely nauseated by Las Vegas last year and flat out refused to attend. The championship situation in terms of drivers was fairly simple. Keke Rosberg led by 9 points, which was the number of points awarded for a win. So, if John Watson won the race and Rosberg didn't score, they would finish equal on points, and Watson would be awarded the title on number of races won. But if Keke scored even 1 point, he would be champion whatever John did. The British media were, needless to say, playing up Watson's chances, but he and everyone else knew it was a long shot. The permutations in the Constructors' Championship were more complicated, with 3 teams still in the running, the first time since 1964 that this had been the case at the last race, but the quick version is that the title was Ferrari's to lose, while Renault were a real outside shot. Gordon Murray's absence meant that the Brabham team struggled, as he was the main technical mastermind, and Renault took full advantage with another front-row lockout. Behind them, though, there were 2 surprises, Michele Alboreto in the Tyrrell and Eddie Cheever in the Ligier, suddenly going well for some reason. Then came Patrese, Rosberg and Andretti, with Tombe 8th after a recurrence of his arm pain, and Watson down in 9th, alongside a delighted Derek Warwick in the new Tolman. Lafitte was 11th, Piquet 12th, and Lauda down in 13th, and with Keegan squeaking his march onto the back of the grid, the non-qualifiers were Byrne, Fabi, Salazar and Serra. Jarier had qualified in 20th, after having had a wheel fall off during the second qualifying session, but despite being uninjured, he withdrew from the event. Depending on which version you believe, either the team elected not to repair the car, or Jarier walked out in frustration, all of which allowed Tommy Byrne to move up onto the grid. During Saturday morning's pre-race warm-up, there were 2 more casualties. Patrick Tombe again withdrew thanks to the pain in his back and arm from that pinched nerve, and Roberto Guerrero blew his ensign's engine, and the cash-strapped team had no spare. At this late stage of the season, nobody else had a spare they were willing to lend them either, so Ensign also withdrew, with a big question mark hanging over their future. Both of those happened after the deadline for moving reserve drivers up to the grid, so 24 cars formed up on Saturday afternoon for the race. An uneventful start saw Prost and Arnoux dicing for the lead, with Alain coming out ahead, with Alboreto hanging on to 3rd. Patrese moving up to 4th, then Cheever and Andretti following. It would be interesting to see how the rivalry between Prost and Arnoux played out here, with Renault's slim title hopes resting on a 1-2 finish, while the 2 drivers will have both wanted to beat the other in their last race as teammates. As it went, on lap 2, Prost made a rare mistake, missed a gear, and Rene gratefully accepted the gifted lead. Certainly, the pair of them very quickly left Alboreto in the dust, but Patrese in 4th wasn't making any impression on the Tyrrell, so the race very quickly settled down. Derek Warwick was finding his Tolman a handful on full tanks, and quickly accumulated a queue of frustrated cars trying to get past, including John Watson, while Rosberg was in 7th and trying to find a way past Andretti for that vital point. Patrese had by now also found himself at the head of a group, with Cheever, Andretti, Rosberg and Piquet all running close together, and Cheever, no doubt keen to make an impression in front of his home crowd, was attacking Patrese. Jacques Laffite ended his 7-year stint at Ligier in deeply anticlimactic fashion, with a failed spark plug after 5 laps, his 11th retirement of 1982. Both he and Williams would be hoping for better things for him next year, while Nigel Mansell tangled with Mauro Baldi's arrows and wound up in the barriers. Meanwhile, John Watson had got past Warwick and motored up to the back of the Patrese parade, found his way past Piquet, and was now attacking Rosberg. This was the scrap between the two championship contenders, but if the commentators were expecting fireworks, they were to be disappointed, as Watson simply breezed past Rosberg. So had he caught the Finn napping, or had Rosberg made a tactical decision not to defend the place, relying on retirements ahead of him to gift him the point he needed? Watson was certainly on a charge, getting past Andretti and Cheever in fairly short order, then being gifted 4th when Patrese suddenly slowed with a clutch failure on lap 17. That also moved Rosberg up to 7th, which became 6th 3 laps later when Arnoux toured in with engine trouble. Now all Rosberg had to do was finish, while Watson, now 3rd, needed to take 2 more places and hope something happened to the Williams. In 2nd, meanwhile, was a very impressive Michele Alboreto, who was still running about 8 seconds behind Prost and over 30 ahead of Watson. Further back, Rosberg was shaping up to have a go at Andretti on lap 27 when the Ferrari suddenly slewed sideways into the sand with a suspension breakage. On the same lap, and off-camera, Piquet's and Brabham's dire 1982 came to an end when one of his spark plugs disintegrated and fell into the cylinder with fatal results for the engine. A lap later it was Lotus's turn to pack up and hope for better next year, as De Angelis' Ford also expired smokily, while Niki Lauda was having an entertaining duel with Andrea De Cesaris, the man he'd replaced in the McLaren team this year. It was by now the most interesting thing happening on the circuit. Andrea had been one of the most improved drivers of 1982 thus far, and held his own with the double champion for some time before the wily Austrian found a way past and headed off in pursuit of Derek Daly and the points. So approaching half-distance, Prost led from Alboreto, now by about 14 seconds, with Watson another 13 seconds behind the Tyrrell, then Cheever, Rosberg and Daly making up the top 6, and Lauda rapidly bearing down on the Irishman. As things stood, it was Rosberg's title, but there were still plenty of ways for Watson to win. Lauda disposed of Daly much more easily than he had De Cesaris, while the other Irishman in the race, Tommy Byrne, spun his Theodore out while trying to get out of the way of the front-runners who were lapping him. For a man who'd been quoted earlier in the season saying he didn't much care about famous names as long as they stayed out of his way, it wasn't a great note to finish the season on, and with reports that he'd been foisted on an unwilling team by their paymasters, he probably wasn't flavour of the month over at Theodore. As the race wore on in the sweltering heat, Prost's tyres began to fade, and Alboreto began to catch up. Soon he was tucked up under the Renault's rear wing, and Alain, recognising that he'd need to back off to try and make his tyres last, allowed the Tyrrell through to take the lead. Lauda was out with an engine failure a little over 3/4 distance, as his teammate Watson reeled in Prost and took 2nd place, still chasing that vital win, but Rosberg was still 5th, so unless that changed it would be academic anyway. The last 20 laps saw little change as the sapping conditions persuaded most drivers to simply aim at finishing. Prost lost 3rd to his future teammate Cheever, but at the front Alboreto drove a calm, measured and very mature race to become the 4th man in 5 races and the 5th this season to take a maiden win, and probably the most unlikely of them all. It was Tyrrell's first win since 1978, and whatever Ken Tyrrell had promised Denim in terms of TV coverage for their brand, they can't have been expecting this. John Watson was 2nd, nearly 30 seconds behind Alboreto, and looking happy enough on the podium. He knew coming into the race that it was an outside shot and was satisfied with his efforts, and Eddie Cheever was also happy to end his dreadful Ligier year on a high note. Prost nursed his Renault home 4th, and Daly picked up the last point in his last race for Williams. For the 2nd year running, though, the happiest driver was the one who finished 5th. Last year, Nelson Piquet had to be carried from his car and revived before he could be presented as champion. Keke Rosberg fairly leaped from his cockpit and distributed hugs around the team in a most un-Finnish manner. It seemed slightly harsh on poor Alboreto to overshadow his first win, but he didn't seem to mind, and he and Rosberg celebrated on the podium along with prizegiver Diana Ross. The 1982 season had, in the end, fizzled out slightly with a couple of rather dull races, but although some purists bemoaned that the eventual title winner had been the one who plugged away reliably rather than the one who won the most races, few begrudged Keke Rosberg a championship which would have seemed unthinkable at this time last year when Rosberg was released by the Fittipaldi team. Ferrari, meanwhile, took the Constructors' title, their first since 1979, despite barely figuring in the race at all, as their rivals also failed to do what was required, and could take some little consolation in that for a pretty rough season all told. Formula One as a sport went into the winter break with much to think about. 2 driver fatalities and a slew of other accidents would require some response from the governing body and organisers, and while the FISA-FOCA conflict had died down in the shock of Villeneuve's death and the realisation that the season was far from the turbo walkover that had been feared, there was still the potential for further politicking over the winter as new rules were thrashed out. 11 drivers representing 7 teams had won during the season, 5 of them for the first time, and 26 of the 40 drivers and 14 of the 18 teams had put points on the board. Rumours swirled about the future of some teams who were either running out of money or running out of goodwill with their corporate masters, so there would be plenty for the sporting papers to report on over the winter.